Okay, good morning, everybody. And first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. This is the first time I've been in Iași, and I'm really pleased to be with our members, the Romanian Women's Lobby. And I congratulate you as well for the fantastic work that you're doing. I apologize, I don't speak Romanian, so I will try to speak slowly, because I know that sometimes you can go, get carried away. So if I need to slow down even further, please don't hesitate to put your finger up. So I'm very honored, and it's with great pleasure that I'm here today to present to you the European Women's Lobby Collective Manifesto. And I really insist on the word collective, because it hasn't been drafted by a couple of us in the Secretariat in Brussels. It has really been a participatory input from all of our members. In our organization, we have a number of different structures that enable us to reach out in a maximum way to members of members. So, for example, you could be able to really participate in these working structures and to develop in collaboration together what we want from Europe. And what we want from Europe means the local, regional, national, European. It's at every stage. So it really is relevant to every single level of policy making and decision making. And I suppose why a manifesto? Obviously, the European elections will be next year and will take place throughout Europe between the 6th and the 9th of June. So it will all be happening at the same time, and that's important too, because I think it's really going to give a real push to all of us to ensure that we're going to have a holistic feminist agenda. That's what we're setting out to do. And why is it so important to have a manifesto? Because we're still living in a patriarchal society. And I had the pleasure of participating at your informal meeting just before this meeting, and all of the issues you raise, you hear them everywhere, whether it's in Finland or Portugal, Greece, Bulgaria, Germany, the UK. Well, the UK isn't an EU member state anymore, but Ireland, wherever. They really are very similar. So we have to really set about having a feminist agenda and a feminist Europe. That is our goal and that is our aim. And that's the reason why this manifesto has been put together. And I'm really pleased as well that we were able to translate it in 22 languages, so that all of our members throughout the EU can actually have an accessible document that enables them to really set about getting our feminist agenda together, and also to call for a feminist Europe. I'm just going to, the manifesto has many different sections in it, but I'm just going to point out some of the realities today in Europe. So, for example, women are still dying because of a lack of access to abortion. That is a reality in Europe today. And the backlash against sexual and reproductive health and rights is a reality in many countries. Not just the countries that we hear about, but in many countries. So this is something that we really need to stand up against. 1 in 3 women have experienced physical and or sexual violence since the age of 15. Now that's 1 in 3. That's huge. And 1 in 2 women, so every second woman, has experienced sexual harassment in the workplace. And the higher you go up the ladder, actually you're more exposed to sexual harassment. Some of the data shows that up to 75% of women in managerial positions have experienced sexual harassment. That's almost every single woman. This is quite daunting. Every week, an average of 50 women die at the hands of ex-partners or partners, which we're now, our membership is really mobilizing to call for a crime of femicide in the national, obviously, penal codes. And that is something that we will set about once we have other things that have to be finalized now. But that's very daunting. 50 on average a week, and that's everywhere, again, in every single country. In terms of pay and pensions, particularly, which are the two sides of the same coin, there's still a pay gap of around 14% in the European Union, on average. Obviously varies in different countries, but when you look at the pensions gap, the gender pension gap, it's almost 40%, 40%, which means that as women age, the risk of being in a situation of poverty is far greater. So these are still things that we absolutely have to work on and make sure that these issues are addressed. And then on average, there are about 38% of women in national parliaments. Now, the European Parliament has done a little bit better because it has increased over the years. But but we're not at parity yet. We're not at 50% yet. But at national parliament level, only not even 40% on average. Again, on average, it varies between countries. So this is the background in which we are operating. These are the facts and the realities of the lives of women throughout Europe. And again, as I say, it's their averages, and it's every single country, and no one country can say we're doing better than the other. And it's good to remind ourselves as well that there is not one single country in Europe, or in the world for that matter, where gender equality exists. And that's quite daunting in this day and age, 2023, and we still haven't achieved, no country has achieved gender equality. So these are the reasons why that we really need to have a manifesto to push, to come together, and for our voices to be heard, so that we can work towards having a feminist Europe. Now, we can't deny either that, and the manifesto also points this out, that we have had some progress in the last, particularly when we're looking at the framework of the mandate of the European Union, so the 5 years of the European Commission and the European Parliament. And we have had, for the first time in the European history, a woman president of the European Commission. And she has not been just a symbolic leader. She has really put issues on the table. And for example, she has put pay transparency. So we now have a directive, which is law, and which will be transposed into national law within the coming years, on pay transparency. So again, it's tried to look at this pay gap and try to address it. Because it means that pay transparency means that you will have the right to ask what the pay conditions are of your similar your colleagues working in similar situations. So it will give you access to information, and it also will mean that companies with over 250 employees will be obliged to have annual reports on the pay compositions within companies. Now, as the European Women's Lobby, we believe that equal pay shouldn't depend on the number of employees, that it should be automatic, and therefore we were pushing very hard for there to be a mandatory reporting every year, regardless of the size of companies, because, as well as that, the majority of women workers work in small and medium-sized enterprises. So if you're imposing something on 250 employees, it means that you're excluding a majority of women. But there are other mechanisms within this directive which will allow reporting mechanisms, not as frequently as on an annual basis, but it will certainly be there. So this is something we also have to keep an eye on, and particularly when it is being transposed into national law. The European Union acceded to the Istanbul Convention, which is really, really good news, because I know that we all know that some countries are backlashing very, very much against that. But this is really good for the European Union as an entity. And again, it will only be related to the areas of competence, but nevertheless, it opens the door. And hopefully will open the door to pressure those countries that have either withdrawn their accession or are stalling their accession, put a little bit of peer pressure on them. So because there will be mechanisms within the reporting mechanisms on the Istanbul Convention for the EU that the member states will also have to comply by. There is currently a directive, again law, on violence against women and domestic violence on the political agenda. Perhaps later we'll have an opportunity to talk more about that, because it is encountering quite a lot of resistance, and particularly regarding the article on rape. But we will come back to that. There is also the adoption of this 12-year proposal on women on boards, which means that women in CEOs, for example, and women in the quoted companies, that there will be quotas, I suppose, at the end of the day is what you can say, to ensure that there will be more women on boards. And again, I just want to point out that quotas, I know that quotas cause a lot of discussion, should we have them, should we not have them, etc. But quotas are a means to an end, and they're not an end in themselves. So quotas are a tool to provoke change and to really make sure that we accelerate change. Because if we're waiting for things to happen kind of naturally, we could be waiting a long, long time. And also just to say that the European Commission also adopted what they call a European care strategy. And this is the first time that care has been also on the political agenda. It looks at childcare and long-term care. It's not binding, but it is, again, for us, again, it's not enough, but it's a start. And it's a start in the right direction. So this is what's happened. And also there's been a commissioner for equality. Not only gender equality, but all forms of equality, which also gives the opportunity to ensure that the diversity of women, and you were talking about the 51% minority, and I think it's really important that we say that women is not a minority, more than half of the population, and they're not a group, because we often hear group of women. No, they're not a group. They're half of the population, more than half of the population, and therefore it's absolutely essential that every single policy is seen and addressed through a gender lens, because every single policy impacts differently on women and men. So that's all the good news. But however, against the backdrop of all this, there are many and multiple challenges, as we all know. We're living in a world of turmoil. You know, the COVID-19 pandemic, the Russia invasion of Ukraine, and all of the other conflicts and wars that are happening all over the world, the energy crisis, the climate crisis, natural disasters, galloping inflation, and the shrinking space of civil society organizations, and particularly women's organizations. And the resources, the lack of resources, which you also talked about earlier on. And that is really very worrying, because what we can see as well is that there will be, you know, our budgets, public budgets will, because of conflict and war, will actually be transferred more into a security agenda. So again, we're going to have to look at, be very creative and finding ways to ensure that the funding streams are there. And I think we need to work on different levels. We need to work on, you know, obtaining grants and funds for women's organizations, and particularly in the context of the Istanbul Convention and the service provision. And that is a way as well of ensuring that there are more, well, that there will be finances and fundings for that. But we also need to think structurally and the long term. And for example, our manifesto also talks about what we call gender budgeting, which means that having a gender lens in finances, because it does look at the sustainability and the long term. And it means basically having a gender mainstreaming process to public funding. Asking very simple questions: who benefits? And who, you know, the investments that are being made, actually, what's the impact on gender equality? Are they actually increasing the gaps, or are they decreasing the gaps? And if they are increasing the gaps, or if they're seen to be neutral, we need to ensure that we have data and that we have we have mechanisms in place that will address those. So this is also, again, in the manifesto, it's looking at the European budget, which is a big 7-year budget, which we call the multi-annual financial framework. And what we really want, and we're going to start now or tomorrow, is to have a task force to really ensure that the next budget has gender budgeting and gender mainstreaming within it, and to make it compulsory, because it's only when it is compulsory that it will be done. For the moment, there are there are attempts to look at it, which again is a good start, but we need to have something firmly embedded, and that is also mandatory, so that there is no backtracking, there are no excuses, you just have to do it. So that's also in the manifesto as well. And these are some of the issues that we're calling for. So I just want to also say that the manifesto, and I don't know which page it's on, and I'm sorry, I think it's page 3 in the English version, so if you want to go to that. So the manifesto basically calls on the EU and national decision makers, to provide funds and to make binding measures in a number of areas. So parity, democracy. I think that is something that we all want, and we want to really ensure that that happens. And it means really making a very, very robust measures to ensure that women are on the lists, and that also tackling what we call the gatekeepers, which are the political parties as well, because they have the power to decide the electoral lists and where women will be placed on those electoral lists as well. Because the European elections, for example, is still very much in national constituencies. There's no European list across Europe, and political parties form their own lists at national level. So it's really important that the political parties themselves are addressed, and they have to be addressed now, because they will be forming and constituting their lists right now. We want to also ensure that women's economic independence is guaranteed, and we believe that we need to have a feminist economic model. The neoliberal model is not working. It's not working, and certainly not working for women. We really need to have a feminist economic model, and that means looking at issues like pay, pensions, poverty, but also care. Care is so important, and women have been taking their responsibility for care for decades and decades, and are not recognized at all for that, and are not valued for the work that they're doing. We could see during the COVID pandemic that women were at the forefront, and they were providing all of the care in health, in every sector, and they were really the backbone of society. And if they hadn't been there, actually our economies would have collapsed. So we need to have, and what we call for in the manifesto as well, a care deal for Europe. And what does that mean? It means valuing care, but it also means investing in care, in a multitude of services right across the European Union. And this can flow from the European funds that member states receive, and whether it's the recovery and resilience funds, which countries are now receiving as well, in the aftermath of COVID, to ensure that they're rebuilding not only their infrastructures, but to ensure that these issues are really addressed. So this is one issue that we really are focusing on, is a care deal for Europe. Also then, obviously the whole issue of violence against women, which is one of the main, I would say, priorities of the European Women's Lobby, and which is an issue and a priority that's shared by every single member from the very beginning, because violence against women is a real barrier to women's full participation in all areas of life. And when we talk about violence against women, we see it as a continuum. That means that if it's violence in the home, in the public space, at work, and more online, it's all part of the same continuum. It's part of, embedded again in the patriarchal system that aims to control women at the end of the day. So this is a massive area of work for us, and we have a whole section as well in the manifesto that calls for a number of different measures to finally put an end to violence against women. And then the whole area of exploitation, sexual exploitation of women in particular. Again, fueled and fed by the patriarchal system. And this refers to prostitution, to pornography, to everything that's associated with the so-called sex industry. That it's exploitation for the European Women's Lobby. It is exploitation, it's part of violence against women, and it needs to be ended. So we call for what we call the equality model, which means that, which is for the moment, which stemmed initially from Sweden, but now today it's been also expanded to France and to Ireland. And hopefully there will be more countries as well that will adopt that model. And it means that the focus is taken away from women themselves that are trapped in those systems, and that the onus is put on the buyers. And it also means that we need to invest as well in exit, what we call exit programs, so that women can have real choices in their lives, because for the moment there's very little investment in the fact that women can actually have the possibility of leaving those systems. And also it includes trafficking in women as well. I think perhaps that's one area where we all agree, but we are really very pleased as well that the European Parliament adopted recently a report. It's an own initiative report, so again it's not legally binding, but it recognizes that prostitution is exploitation and is forms violence against women. So it's a start again, and our manifesto calls as well to make sure that the follow-up to this report will be effective. Guarantee women's bodily autonomy, going back to the manifesto as well. And again, as I was saying, the sexual and reproductive health and rights, we see that there's a massive impact right across Europe. From some countries, very blatant, like in Poland, but in other countries as well, changes to the law and all sorts of things happening in a discreet way as well. But at the end of the day, it is about, withdrawing and holding back women's right to sexual and reproductive health and rights. And we're calling for, in the manifesto, for it to become a European competence, which it isn't for the moment, but it would be part, and to integrate it into the European Charter of Fundamental Rights. Whether that might necessitate a change to the European treaties, but nevertheless, this is something that we are really calling for, because as I said, women are still dying in Europe today because of a lack of access to sexual and reproductive health and rights, and particularly abortion rights. So another area that we call for in the manifesto is women's voices in peace building. And that is more relevant today than it ever was. What do we see around the world? The eruption of tensions, conflicts, again, fueled and fed by patriarchal system. And there are no women around the negotiating table. And we want the resolution, the UN resolution 1325 on women, peace and security to be effectively implemented. That's a resolution that was adopted back in 2000. And here we are, almost 24 years later, and it still hasn't been effectively implemented. And it's now is urgent, absolutely urgent, for women to be around the negotiating table and to start talking about peace and conflict resolution. And it's desperately, I think we'll all agree, desperately, desperately needed today. Because again, war and tension is very much an expression of the patriarchal system, and we need to ensure that women are at the table and are negotiating. Moving forward, I mean, I think we're all listening to what's happening all over the world, and it's women and children that are most affected. Collateral damage in these conflicts and war, no matter where they are, and this needs to end. So we have a very strong section on that as well. And then, obviously, because we're moving into the green and digital transition, we're moving into a green economy, low carbon emissions, investments in a more sustainable economic model, although we feel it's following the neoliberal model, but nevertheless, we need to look at the green and the digital transition. And what we see, and very worryingly, is that women are not included. If we look, for example, at the Green Deal, the European Green Deal, and the investments primarily in the construction sector in terms of energy efficient construction, and also in terms of the car industry, to move away from fossil fuels and to move into electric cars. Both of those sectors are dominated, highly dominated by men. So again, there is no investments targeted at women or to enable women to be part of the green transition as well. And the policy itself lacks a gender mainstreaming and lacks a gender analysis and a gender perspective. So we believe that that has to be. It's really urgent as well, because that is happening as we speak. So the each section of the manifesto goes through each of these sections that I've just highlighted to you. I'm not going to go through them all in detail, but I hope that you will all get an opportunity to read them. They're all specific measures that are both addressed to the EU and to national policymakers as well. So they're, these must go hand in hand. And I think what's really important as well is the manifesto addresses different audiences. It's not just for the political parties. It is for the candidates themselves, first of all, calling on them to make sure that they will integrate a feminist perspective in their election campaign, but, and this is really important, that they will commit, once elected, to ensuring that they'll follow up on what they have committed to do. And we will be keeping an eye on them. We will make sure that those who have been elected afterwards will actually follow up on the commitments that they have made. And we will be seeking commitments from them prior to the election. So again, this is something that I would really strongly encourage you to do with your own candidates, is to get them to a pledge, if it's possible, sign up to a pledge, and to follow up afterwards, because that is really key. Then the manifesto addresses the European and national political parties, and I spoke about that. It's about ensuring that, the political parties themselves have a system by which women are not only candidates, but they're in positions where they will be elected. And it also means looking at the head of lists, because often the head of lists, that's really an important place to be, a position to be. And I know that you'll be talking about that afterwards. So there's the ZIP system there, but the system is, at the end of the day, is to make sure that women are in places where they can be elected, where they will be elected. Then the manifesto also addresses the media. The media plays a massive role as well, to ensure that, first of all, women candidates get unbiased access to media outlets, and that they get the same speaking time, and that they get the same exposure, if you like, to the media, but also that they are protected as well, because the media, we're calling on the media to ensure that stereotyping, violence, particularly online violence, is going to be challenged, because we can see right across Europe again that women's access to the media is limited, and when they have access to the media, it can be in a very stereotypical way, and also can be in a way that undermines and objectifies them as well as women. So we're really challenging the media to step away from that and to play their role in ensuring that that everybody gets a chance of equal exposure in the media. Then the manifesto also addresses the electorate, which means the voters, and encourage them to engage with the candidates, to check their track record, and to also follow up with them afterwards. And basically the message is to the electorate, the voters, which includes all of us as well, is to vote for feminist candidates. At the end of the day, that's what we're aiming for, is a feminist agenda, a feminist Europe, and we need to ensure that our candidates are feminist and that we will end up voting for them. And then finally, it also addresses the European institutions to take responsibility as well for the democratic and fair and equal elections process, and also to create a safe environment, because we all are aware of those forces that are out there and that are really making every effort to undermine our democratic processes and to destabilize. So we really need to have very robust systems in place to make sure that this isn't going to happen, and to ensure that everybody can participate in a democratic way across Europe for the elections, which will determine our futures, but not only our future generations as well. So this is part of, passing the flame, I would say, to the future generations as well. And I think we owe it to the future generations, who will one day ask us, why did we not ensure that gender equality and women's rights were firmly established in our systems across Europe? And when I say Europe, I'm talking about national, local, regional, European, because I think we need to look at Europe as a togetherness, collective, and coming back to the title of your forum today, of solidarity. And that's where we need to be heading for the future. So thank you very much. I'll leave it at that. As I say, I won't go into all the details in the manifesto, but each section has details and also a call for specific measures in this area. But again, it's about making sure we're coherent and that we have overall a feminist agenda. So thank you very much.